So much more. Okay, you're so excited. Saying that. Yes, it is. I'm scared. So that was and I had to do I don't so much is it's gotta be.
Oh, like that.
And he can totally be bullied if it's where the thoughts.
So that was like. But also like. Right on the I feel like that's something. Judgment is getting. I'm staying on like.
Soon.
Staying.
It's a-
That was I don't know, listening to the, yeah. So. So the search that I have access to the session rules and yeah, and then I said they're in the same probably that session pay when you're in. Is there any other ones you guys think of? First hand. Chemistry. Yeah.
So let's give us a few more minutes and then we can talk about it together.
I like always sit in this.
Got it right there. Yeah, I don't just know your plan. If somebody needed it.
Yeah. So sleep.
It's just.
Everybody, yeah. So you know, I'm very. I try. Just fine. Like. But it's still. It's like one other way. I need to be. Like.
Oh my gosh.
Just like.
Let's see what now. She's back in the office again. Come on, Pam.
Yeah.
So she's like, oh, it's the one together before I collect. And then. I'll stop down. Yeah. You did it. Oh my God. Yeah, definitely put your first and last names on there.
Okay, so yeah. Yes. So, yeah. All right, does everybody?
Okay, let's go ahead and talk about this together and then I'll collect them from you. But I think this song does a really good job of kind of connecting to some of this stuff. Like surprisingly, right? The video is definitely, a little out there, but I think the song and the lyrics are very connected. What did you come up with? Anyone have like a lyric that's next to something? I saw a lot of you kind of highlighting and writing on here, which is perfect. Yeah.
When you are away, we said that would be like a lack of oxytocin.
Okay.
Like there's physical intimacy withdrawal with your partner.
Yeah, right. Like literally feeling that crash when you're not with that person that you're desiring. You can view it in another way too, and I think that fits as well. It's perfect. I like it. Yeah.
I think that thing is dopamine because it's dopamine has a tendency to make you crave more dopamine.
Yeah, sure.
And it's kind of the type of hormone that will
Or neurotransmitter. That's okay.
That makes you go seek out things and want things.
Yeah, dopamine very much has that like focused attention on somebody, right? And so you could view it in either way, right? Like not being around them feeling that crash or like the depletion of something, or like that focused attention and desperation for somebody. What else did you come up with? There was another hand, or do you have another one? Yeah, another one, you can go for it.
The lyrics, maybe I need some sleep, partly like an awake from.
Yeah.
And there was another one that. Oh, yeah, here it is. And I'm staying up all night. We're all norepinephrine. Yeah,
right. Your heart pounding, not being able to sleep because you're so stimulated. Definitely norepinephrine, or we could say adrenaline as well. What else? Other things? Other people with thoughts? Yeah, thank you.
Right. So like I was saying that like, oh, like your love is my drug. I'm addicted. It's like dopamine because that's like what your brain is addicted to when you are actually addicted to drugs.
Sure, right. That dopamine, that rush of like pleasure, and again with dopamine, that focused attention. What about the like obsession and craving? Can we link anything to that? Yeah.
It's kind of like to oxytocin. I was like, it said oxytocin can like either read from like the complex or DB. So I thought that oxytocin was
Sure. So oxytocin gives you that like feeling that people tend to get when they either like have physical contact with somebody, or orgasm, or like also with breastfeeding after childbirth. So it's actually like serotonin will do that too. right? So serotonin has really strong correlates with OCD, because serotonin plays a big role in that like obsessive craving that you have. So like some of the parts in here, like I've got a sick obsession, like that obsessive piece could be serotonin kind of coursing through your system, right? There is a lot of overlap between all of these. They create similar things going on, but I think that one fits pretty well there. Anything else? What about any other lyrics that people highlighted or like underlined, things that that might be indicating anything? Anything else? What do we got? So lots of great marks on your papers, but anything else? Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
I wasn't sure if that would like correlate with one specific.
Sure.
Read kind of mixture.
Yeah. Yeah, and I love that you said that, right? It's kind of, these things don't always exist in isolation, right? Like we have all of them coursing through our system. And so I think you could go with like the rush, that she's having would be very much like dopamine, right? The inability to sleep and being very like up and stimulated would be norepinephrine. And you can kind of dissect them apart a little bit as well. And then you can talk about how they are together, right? Poor judgment, right? That like addictive kind of like thinking and craving another person. Anyone have anything else? I don't want to steal your thought. If you like highlighted anything else on here, one more minute. Yeah.
PEA is associated with my judgment is kind of getting kind of heavy.
Sure.
So so it's like kind of makes you very feeling like this person is responsible for the happiness you're experiencing in life.
Sure.
It connects this happiness to this person, which can make you like an idealized image of them in your head.
Yeah. And very much those early phases of relationships, that infatuation, it is very idealized. You might not even know them in the slightest, but you're obsessed with them, right? And you want to be near them. And it's a lot of those very like idealized thinking, maybe poor judgment, craving, obsession, like all of those things are happening, which can make it hard to sleep, hard to focus, hard to concentrate. And you can see too why people might even become kind of addicted to this feeling. Like there are people who avoid commitment and kind of are like, constantly jumping from person to person to keep this feeling, right? It can be kind of an addictive feeling to have of like being obsessed and craving another person. And then when it falls off, again, people viewing it as very like problematic. I think this whole song does a good job of kind of depicting the beginning of a relationship, right? That like craving and infatuation and obsession, like what did the person say last time? Like camping in your head, right? Like they're very much on your mind and it's all you can think about, right? Those endorphins coursing through your system and all of those factors happening at the same time. So,
Ladies and gentlemen.
right. Well, like it doesn't mean that you don't feel those things for real, right? Like it just oftentimes people mistake the chemical for something more, right? And it kind of takes some of that romance out of it, as I mentioned last time. But like you need to have these things in order for that to develop, and then you need to find ways to transition to something a little more long lasting when they start to fade. So make sure your first and last names are on whichever one you are turning in, so I can give you credit for doing that. And then if you want to pass those forward, I will take them back.
And then yours, it's Amber's Armors. Okay. I got you. ERUS. Except those first R. Yeah. So let's start. All right,
so just a couple of other thoughts with this chapter. There's I think 2 more slides and then we'll move on. So a few other things about kind of falling in love and things that we've noticed in terms of research for relationships. There are 4 interesting factors that tend to play a role in falling in love, attraction, and relationships lasting. Right, so we talked about this a little bit with communication. Now we're talking about it in terms of love. The first one makes so much sense if you think about it. Proximity. We tend to fall in love with and be drawn to people that we are geographically, physically close to. people that we interact with on a daily basis, right? So you're more likely to enter into a relationship with somebody that you physically see and interact with than somebody that you don't. I don't think that's very groundbreaking. That makes a lot of sense. If you see someone often and have like interactions and proximity, you're going to be more likely to develop a close relationship than somebody that you maybe see less frequently. Right now, that doesn't mean that you can't have long distance relationships, just statistically, there's a stronger correlation here. There also tends to be a strong correlation in successive relationships with something called reciprocity. Reciprocity means like equality or balance. We tend to do better in relationships that are balanced. It doesn't always have to be balanced, but that it kind of balances out over time. There might be parts of or points in a relationship where one person gives more than another. But if that goes back and forth and kind of alternates and it's pretty balanced, most people tend to do better with that long term than if one person is always giving or one person is always taking. Now, some people are naturally givers or takers as their personality. And if that works in a relationship, it's okay. But traditionally, balance and reciprocity has stronger correlations with relationship success than when it's very one-sided. Yeah.
So balance could be, it doesn't have to just be like one kind of thing.
So it's more like, like if somebody is really needing, they're always needing and taking from the other person and they never give back, that would be like a lack of balance, if that makes sense. So let's say one person needs a lot of support, a lot of reassurance, a lot of like effort and time, but then they don't give that back to their partner. That would be a lack of reciprocity, if that makes sense. So it could be in any realm of your relationship, but we usually think about it in terms of like the effort and time and things that you might put in to it. So typically when they're in balance, like otherwise people develop resentment. I'm always doing all this for you, you never do anything back, right? It can kind of lead to resentment, which can cause problems. Not always, but sometimes. Similarity is important as well, right? So Paula Abdul might say that opposites attract, but they don't tend to stay together. Interestingly, there's strong correlations between people who are similar religious backgrounds, similar like moral beliefs, similar interests. You don't have to like all the same things. Football is one of my favorite things in life. My whole family hates football. Like the second I talk about it, they all roll their eyes and like check out. I'm like, hey, stop it. That's not nice, right? Like every time, it doesn't matter. Even my youngest, like no matter, she was on my side and now she's moved on. I had one shot at like football connection. She's moved on. But we tend to do better with people who are similar. If you really enjoy being outdoors all the time and your partner hates it, that might get in the way, right? If you really are very religious and your partner's not, that could get in the way. Not always, but we tend to do better with people that we are somewhat similar to, at least on like core things. If you're very different politically or religiously or have very, very different backgrounds, it can make it difficult to relate to each other. So traditionally, similarity tends to be a strong indicator. And then someone that you find physically attractive, right? Luckily, physical attraction is in the eye of the beholder, right? Like we all have different standards of what we find attractive and beautiful. But traditionally, people that we find attractive, even if that's an attraction that grows later on, that tends to be a big indicator of relationship success. So these are just 4 things that we've seen over and over again play a strong role in not only attraction, but staying together, right? Having these 4 kind of elements present. And not always, but a lot of the time. One other thing, some characteristics statistically and research-wise of high-quality relationships. Relationships that last tend to be ones that have supportive communication. We talked a lot about communication in the last chapter. You see this person as your companion and best friend, right? You like to spend time with them, right? It doesn't have to be every moment, but you enjoy being around them. You have frequent positive interactions. Gottman and Gottman, the 2 psychologists we talked about, said that this is one of the best predictors of relationships that last. You have frequent, positive, enjoyable interactions with each other. Whether that's laughing at something or going and doing things you enjoy together, you have positive interactions and that can balance out fights or difficulties in your life. You have realistic expectations, you have shared interests, you can face and deal with conflict. A lot of people don't like conflict. They find it very uncomfortable and it can lead to problems, but it can also lead to solutions as well. So being able to talk and deal with and face conflict together, you're able to have intimacy and express what interests you sexually and have some sexual variety. These are things that tend to correlate with relationships that are deemed satisfactory or lasting. And I was looking for a clip for something and there was an ad before it, and it was such a funny like connection to this. I have a little video I want to play for you. It's kind of a side note, but it was one of the like barriers to intimacy for a lot of couples. And this will come up in the film that we're going to watch as well, like talking about technology and how it might help or harm relationships. But I'll play it for you as kind of an interesting side note about relationship satisfaction. I think it relates. Technology is such a big part of our lives, right? I think I told you this before, like I share my bed with TikTok, like a lot. It's like my partner watches so much TikTok. And like I've learned to just join her, like if I want to like spend time with her when she's doing it, I just go watch them with her. And it becomes like a source of bonding. But like, and I'll get caught up in fantasy football. Like we can be in the same room and like spend hours separate on technology. And I don't think that's necessarily a problem all the time, but it can be something that interferes. It's an interesting like thing that a lot of couples face is like the advantages and disadvantages of technology, right? There are a lot of wonderful things it can do, and there are a lot of ways it can interfere. Like my in-laws will come over and my partner and I will send each other like messages back and forth and like gifts back and forth, making fun of them. And it's a bonding experience, right? Like, and it's great. And then there are times when it gets in the way, right? And so it's interesting how technology can be both helpful and harmful. And you could see their like excitement and expectation, and then some of them a little bit let down, right? When like that was the solution. And this is something again that will come up when we watch the film next class and next week. You know, how can this help us and hurt us? Because I think there are advantages and disadvantages to technology, obviously. So just kind of an interesting side note to end this, and then we'll move on. But any other like thoughts, comments, questions, thoughts, anything here before we go to the next chapter? What was that? You thought so? I thought it was kind of appropriate, right? But to each their own. That's the hard thing. We're all so different, right? Okay, so the next chapters are 8 and 9, which I put together. And so we'll focus on 8 for the most part, but we're going to look a little bit at sexuality during childhood, adolescence, and the adult years. We won't get into this too much, but just kind of a couple of highlights. And then we'll be looking mainly at adult sexuality through the film that we're watching, and kind of bringing everything together. So we'll focus more on chapter 8, but we tend to, as people, be a little less comfortable with sexuality at the extremes, right? Sexuality in people who are quite young and sexuality in people who are older, right? Interesting, if I had to propose this to you, we got into like a 2-hour debate about this. Which would make you more uncomfortable? Walking in on your grandparents having sex? Oh, sorry. You're like, oh God, no. Or walking in on your child masturbating, right? Like, which one would make you more uncomfortable? And you don't have to answer that, right? You'll take grandparents, right? I think I'd take grandparents too, because I can make fun of them for it.
You know, they're just doing their thing. It's
Sure.
And they're not, it's not weird, and they're not my kid.
All right.
That's,
Yeah.
I mean, I don't see masturbation as like a shameful thing either, though. Like, obviously, like, you know, like they're like exploring themselves, like all of that. So
you don't have to give your grandparents the talk
That's true.
afterwards.
I know. I still haven't had the talk with my 10-year-old. Shame on me. Like, it's not me. I keep trying to do it. My partner's like super nervous about it. I'm like, I'll talk to her about it. And I don't. Maybe, right? Maybe. I think my 10-year-old might know more than like my grandparents would, like if they were still around, right? But it's something that's interesting. Like, we tend to be uncomfortable with childhood sexuality, and we tend to be uncomfortable with like older adult sexuality. Like, both of them tend to make people a little bit more uncomfortable, but there are sexual elements to both ages, right? This is something that starts young and can persist all the way through life. So it's important to kind of think about the extremes of age, even if it's not kind of what we're mainly focusing on. And children can be very sexual without even realizing why they're being sexual or how they're being sexual. I have a nephew who used to run around the house naked, just pulling on his penis, screaming for hours. Like, that was his thing, like just totally inappropriate. little girls sit on stuff and rock back and forth, like constantly when they're little, like, and because it feels good. It's not necessarily sexual as much as they're like, strangely, this feels good when I do this, so I'm going to keep doing it. We will often go to like water parks or like splash pads. You can watch all the little girls like sitting on the jets. I'm not joking. And it's funny. Like, it's funny because you know exactly, like they're sitting there just laughing. And I'm like, you know exactly why. Like, because it feels good and they don't understand why. It's not necessarily sexual as much as they're like, oh, this feels good and I'm going to keep doing it because I like it. Right. And so a lot of sexuality when we're little is unintentional. Right. It's not necessarily guided by sex as much as like something feels good, or maybe it's more driven by curiosity. Very common for children to have sexual responses to things, even if, again, they aren't knowing what motivates it. We have the capacity for sexual response even before we're born. Right. We talked about this back in that little quiz that we took like on day 2. In the womb, in the uterus, little boys will get erections. Right. You can actually see it on an ultrasound. Right, we have the capacity for sexual response even before birth, right? And so this is something that is very present, and it starts to develop and get like defined and like build as we get older and older and older. In childhood, it's very difficult to define what's like normal, healthy sexual behavior. There's a lot of like sex play and discovery play and pretend play that's common for children. Children will play games like house or doctor, right? Where you might walk in and find siblings or cousins, like exploring each other's bodies and like trying to make sense of them. Like, I don't understand why he's different than me. He has something that I don't have, and I have something that he doesn't have, right? It's a lot of discovery and like curiosity based. So things like pretend play between children isn't something that should cause any alarm, as long as it's driven by curiosity. Now, if it's overtly sexual, that can indicate that they've been exposed to things that they shouldn't have been at a young age, or maybe that there is like some kind of sexual abuse or inappropriate stuff happening in the house. But most of the time, these things are very motivated by like curiosity. And somewhere around like 11 or 12, like it starts to shift a little bit. My 10-year-old still thinks love is gross. And I'm holding on to that as long as I can, right? Like everywhere we go, like if I'll go to kiss my partner, she's like, ew, love is gross. And I'm like, can I just quote you on that? Because I know it's coming, right? Like my niece is at 13 and a boy obsessed. Like everything's about boys. Everywhere we go, he's so cute. I'm going to go talk to him. I'm like, oh God, it's coming. I don't want it, right? My 10-year-old, love is gross. Ew. I'm like, oh, I love it. Thank you. Versus my daughter, Emma, got in trouble for kissing a boy at school last week. In the bathroom. I was all like, I got a note. We got a note sent home. Like, your daughter kissed a boy named Jack in the bathroom. I'm like, oh, Jack is dead. I'm killing Jack tonight, right? And like, talked to her about, she's all like, what? I didn't think anything of it. 8 stuff, right? So I have 3 daughters, so I'm gonna see a lot of it. But a lot of that is just curiosity. She's all like, well, I like him, so I thought I'd kiss him. Okay. I had a range of reactions, like, I'm gonna buy a shotgun and put it over the door, and I'm going to tell all your future boyfriends or girlfriends that whatever you do to them, I'm going to do to you, and see how that goes, right? That's my plan for when they're older, right? So interesting, you see a lot of this. This is normal in childhood, right? A lot of variation. Children start to masturbate, right? And maybe it's purposeful, and maybe it's just kind of like they're exploring their body, right? And our reactions to that set the tone for them, right? I remember my poor cousin, when we were younger, her mom walked in on her masturbating, shamed her for years. And so she grew up with this mentality that like touching yourself was bad, right? And dirty, very, very correlated. They're a very religious family. There's a lot of correlations between masturbation and religion. But these are things that are very normal, and you have to have conversations with your children about them, and try to keep them like as neutral as you can, right? The things that you say, like masturbation is dirty or awful or negative, those impact children. That the mentalities that you have and pass on to them can shape their view of sex as they grow up. So again, a lot of this happening in childhood, but mainly motivated by curiosity. And if it's beyond that and very sexually driven, it could indicate something slightly problematic. I thought this was great, right? I think it's time we got to talk about sex. What would you like to know, right? And I think a lot of us know more than our parents, right? The internet, like, and YouTube. My kids, anytime they need to know the answer to anything, they look it up on YouTube. And I'm like, okay, that's great. but you need to be a little bit skeptical, right? Like, it's not going to teach you everything. Like, please come ask us to, right? They get some really bizarre ideas off of YouTube and the things that they watch. But this is a big thing for a lot of parents, right? Having that talk with your kids at some point about sex, about sexuality, and it changes as they age. The questions that they ask change from age to age to age. And it's really interesting, I can tell you as a parent, to see this, right? Where they go from like, oh, babies come from like a stork, or babies just show up, to like, how were babies born again, right? Like it changes a little bit over time. And as we hit like adolescence, right, this is something that you definitely have to have conversations about, because it's important that your children have some knowledge, right? It's important that children in general have knowledge. We see a lot of changes in sexuality between the ages of roughly 12 to 20. Now, 12 is an average, right? Some girls start their menstrual cycles way earlier. Some it's a little bit later. Boys often enter into puberty a little bit later than women do, or than girls do. But puberty is this period of time where all these rapid changes are occurring. A lot of hormonal like shifts and changes, developing secondary sex characteristics like pubic hair, breasts, a deepened voice, right? These things change for children and teenagers, starting usually around like 12. But again, it can be quite a bit earlier, depending on the child. So we see a lot of secondary sex characteristics developing, people entering into their first relationships for the first time as they're like in their teenage years. We see a lot of things that we call non-coital sex. So coitus is the technical name for like male-female intercourse. It's not a name that most people use, but coitus. So non-coital sex would be any kind of like kissing or oral sex or like touching, right? Anything other than intercourse. And this is very, very common among teenagers, right? To engage in non-coital sex. And we talked about this earlier, but 17 is the average age that most people for the first time. 17, right? Like I have 7 years, 6 years. Fellatio and cunnilingus are the technical names for oral sex. Fellatio being oral sex performed on a man, or like someone who's male, cunnilingus on a woman. But these are very common activities for teenagers to engage in as they're dating and kind of entering into sexuality for the first time. And then again, somewhere around 17 tends to be the average age for intercourse in our country right now. Teenage pregnancy is something the book talks a lot about. Just to kind of mention it, this is something that as people get their menstrual cycles younger and younger, we see more and more pregnancy in people who are younger and younger, right? And so it's not uncommon for teenagers to become pregnant. 1 in 5 sexually active teenage women will become pregnant, right? The rates of this are very high. And again, most people aren't engaging in intercourse till they're like 17. But we do see that there are high levels of teenage pregnancy. Why do you think that might be the case? Why do you think you might be more likely to get pregnant as a teenager than maybe a little bit later in life? Yeah.
Like a lack of knowledge on like contraceptives.
Yeah, that's a big one, right? Like you don't know how to use the contraceptives that are out there and available. Yeah.
I think it's also you're most fertile.
Yeah, you're very fertile when you're younger, which is kind of like, you know, evolutionarily a little bit like off of where we are now. But yeah, you are more fertile as a teenager than you might be, and in your early 20s than you are later in life. Yeah.
Whoever like this is
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah, maybe you don't know what could cause pregnancy, right, at all. Or maybe you don't have access to any kind of birth control methods because it would have to go through parents or go through like different venues. There are very high rates of this because people oftentimes don't know and they don't know how to use them, and then they don't have access to like birth control methods.
I've seen things on phantom pregnancies where women get pregnant, have no symptoms, and then give birth. How likely is that to happen?
I mean, it can happen. It's pretty rare. Usually pregnancy has a lot of physical
So it's
symptoms.
terrifying. I couldn't physically carry a baby, but the idea
Right.
of knowing and then just giving birth.
Oh, I know.
is
And you hear those stories, you know, I went to the bathroom and like gave birth to a baby, right? Like it's so uncommon, but you always hear about it, right? And the idea is it's often people who are overweight and they maybe just didn't notice like a change in like their stomach size, or just like there are no symptoms. Usually pregnancy has a lot of physical things happening, but not always. And so it happens sometimes that people have sex, they get pregnant, they don't even know it, and they carry a baby to term, right? It's not as common as you would think, but it does sometimes happen. And then it always makes the news, right? Or like a scandalous story somewhere, right? So we'll talk in a minute about sex education, but there's a lot of efforts to decrease teen pregnancy. And these are controversial, right? People will be like, oh, we'll make condoms readily available. But if we make condoms available, then are we promoting sex, right? I don't know, right? There's a very like controversial topic, providing low or free cost contraceptives, better sex education, right? Sex education is something that's really interesting. It varies state by state. Every state does it differently. California follows what's called a comprehensive sexuality education program, where it starts young and we kind of scaffold it at every age to be a little bit different based on where people are developmentally. So in California and a lot of other states, it starts in kindergarten, right? With like developmentally appropriate topics. So in kindergarten, it's like boys versus girls, maybe a little bit about gender. Gender is something that has gained a lot of popularity and discussion recently, preventing a wide kind of variety of topics. So in 5th grade, I can tell you that 5th grade starts like, this is how pregnancy occurs, right? And they're talking about pregnancy for my daughter. And like, what are, you know, how do you get pregnant? Not necessarily how to avoid it, but what it is and how it happens, right? And how many of you can remember having sex education at some point in elementary school? What do you remember about it? You remember anything? Like, does anything stand out in your head? Yeah.
I remember seeing, like, when I was in, like, I think 4th or 5th grade, and they were talking about, like, how babies are made, basically. I remember, like, really talking about how other animals
Okay.
procreate rather than, like, humans.
Okay, so relating it more to animals, right? Okay, interesting. Other people, what do you remember? Yeah.
It wasn't like that I remember. Fifth grade, I think.
Uh-huh.
Like all the girls, like all the against the sentence, I think.
Okay.
Then while the guys would just like either like to the playground and played or just
So they separated like boys and girls and talked about different things. Okay, interesting. Yeah.
But yeah, that was how ours was too. And their whole thing was you were under no circumstances allowed to show the other person. I think everyone did like immediately after.
Right,
class,
of course. Of course, right? Like this is what we learned, right? Let's exchange notes. Yeah.
You got this, like, coupon to get one of those books. It was like it was for girls. It was like a little, like it teaches you how to grow up, basically. And on the pages, it showed you how to, like, insert tampon, right? And so after I got it, obviously, and then the next day I brought it to school and I showed all the boys, like, how to insert tampon, and they had so much trouble.
Oh,
It's like a little silly thing,
yeah.
but yeah, I understand. And I had to yeah. I thought everybody did. That's my favorite. So I thought everybody like had it to tampon, and I'm like, why would they know?
Yeah.
But yeah, that's
What a shame, right?
yeah, it was like one of those like the picture of that stuff.
Yeah. I didn't have books like that for when I was in. That's interesting. Like, okay, so getting to take it away and like you're not supposed to, like, still a lot of that, like, hush hush kind of like, interesting. Yeah.
I didn't have sex education in kind of a different perspective, but I didn't have sex education in elementary school because I dropped out
Mhm.
kindergarten to this homeschooling thing down where I am. Same thing. But I got taken to this seminar by my mom when I was curious.
Sure.
And it was a seminar called Heart to Heart.
Mhm.
And she got me this book that had, I was hearing me be like, oh, we've got this book, and I was like, remember?
Uh-huh.
So yeah, there's this book, just filled with like information on periods and various things. And I go to this like seminar every day, and they just basically tell us use condoms.
Yeah. Yeah, and so anyone talking about using condoms is definitely up here, right? Like this is very like much more progressive, right? So if you're getting books about like what is a menstrual cycle and how to use tampons and like what is sex and how do people get pregnant, that's very much up on the top one, right? And that tends to be like California's approach, like again, scaffolding, right? So my daughter this year, they're learning about pregnancy and menstrual cycles, right? And their teacher is male. He told us at open house, he's all like, so we're going to be talking about periods. I'm going to be absent that day. And my associate next door, who's female, will be taking that over. He's like, I don't need to know if they have it. They have it. Like, you know, like so uncomfortable. I'm like, you're teaching fifth graders. You gotta like push yourself a little bit. But they team teach and the other teacher's female. And so she took over that part. He took the boys and she took the girls, very gendered, which is interesting. And that's something that's also changing a little bit. But that's comprehensive programs. And then it builds as you get older. Let's talk about contraceptives and safe sex and things like that. But it's very like developmentally appropriate. Yeah.
That brought me back when I was in middle school. We went on like a trip. I think I was in like 8th grade or something.
Okay.
DC, and the teacher that was like leading it was a guy, and then there was like the vice principal who was a girl that was going. And I remember like he had to talk to all the girls about like if you might get your period, if you travel, so you have to like bring stuff to like be prepared, and like how awkward it was.
Sure.
And like he was making it more awkward than it like really was.
Yeah.
I think he just didn't want like anyone to feel uncomfortable.
Sure.
Yeah.
And it's not the most comfortable thing to talk about, especially with that age where they're like, you know, it is kind of like I said, my daughter's in that like love is gross. She doesn't want to talk about these things. Like we tried to talk about like things like that with her and she's like, I don't want to, you know, like, and that's normal for that age. But it's important that it changes with them, right? So that you are covering things that are going to help them and understand what's going on. Yes.
Sexual education, we had like one in 4th grade, 5th grade, 6th grade, 8th grade, and then freshman year of high school.
Yeah.
Total of like 5 videos.
Right.
And you could opt out of them.
Okay.
So like when my cousin was homeschooled up until 8th grade, and so like the 4th grade one, the 5th grade one, the 6th grade.
Missed all those.
She missed all.
Uh-huh.
Not give her like the actual like talk.
Sure.
She was like in, I don't know, 8th grade, like a year ago, and she's already like 15. And I'm like, you're a little late on this.
Yeah.
So between like my cousin, my sister, and me, and then my aunt, we just like all just did it all for her because
Sure.
I don't know, she never had to do that because this is her first daughter. So
Yeah.
it's like she never really had to do that for her son, obviously. So it was like, I was like, what are you like? You have to do it eventually, or else it's just they're gonna figure it out for themselves.
Yeah, and it's tricky. You don't want it to be too early, but you also don't want it to be too late. Where they're
I
like,
think
well, yeah, I know all that already.
6th
You know?
grade is like,
Yeah.
like, even if they have-
Right.
like it's like you're preparing them so they're not like come to you at 3 o'clock in the morning, like scared out of their mind.
Sure. Yeah, and before middle school is like a really like
But I think
good time. Mhm.
it's like super.
Yeah, and usually in like 2nd, 3rd, like 4th, like what they're doing is introducing. Yeah, hygiene and
Yeah.
like gender.
It's like what when the videos in 4th grade, 5th grade, they were more like hygiene. When you get to middle school and then freshman year in high school, it's more like
Yeah,
the other stuff.
right,
But
right.
I think we probably have a consent and sexual assault talk in with kids in schools.
They usually in middle, like high school tends to be something that starts to come up.
Yeah, in middle school, you had to like your parents had to sign up for it.
Yep.
And like your parents could watch the video
Yep.
beforehand.
Yeah, we had to sign up for them this year, which was,
Yeah.
I was like, oh, yeah, do it. Did you have your hand up? Did you have a thought? Like, I thought I saw your hand shoot up. So, okay, you sure? Okay, so the other way that this can manifest is you can get what's called abstinence only programs. And this is something that is still practiced. A lot of states that are more like conservative or more like red tend to do this. Abstinence only programs are more like, don't have sex or you'll die, right? Don't have sex, you'll get like gonorrhea. You know, like we don't talk about it. We're not going to talk about anything related to sex because if we talk about it, you're going to want to do it. Right. And tends to be true also of drug use as well. These similar programs in those schools always makes me think of Mean Girls. If you've ever watched that. right? Like who doesn't know very much, right? And like my sex ed, I remember back, it was my gym teacher with like very, very short little shorts. Like he knew nothing and he was uncomfortable talking about sex. It was hilarious, like looking back on it. But those are very commonly like the sentiments in an abstinence only program. Don't have sex, you'll get like an STI or an STD. Don't have sex, you'll get pregnant. Don't have sex, it'll lead to this. We're not going to talk about it, just don't have sex, right? Abstinence only or abstaining from sex is the other way that this can be presented. California, again, is much more at the top, but there are a lot of states that do approach it from this bottom perspective of like, we're just not going to talk about it, right? And that's our focus. Right. Right, yeah, it's interesting, right? There tend to be higher rates of STIs and STDs because there's no awareness of how to keep yourself safe from them, right? And so there's a danger in both of us. Like there are pluses and minuses to both, you know, and there's a lot of dangers of not telling people how you get pregnant, right? And they don't know, right? They don't know how to protect themselves, how to use birth control. But if you talk about it too early, right, it could in theory make somebody more like, you know, knowledgeable and interested, right? So there are kind of advantages and disadvantages on both sides. Yeah. They don't work out. They don't. And oftentimes teenagers, the nature of being a teenager, there's a lot of rebelliousness as a teenager, right? So if you tell me I can't do it, I'm going to go do it, right? And that tends to be something that we see a lot. People will have abstinence only when it comes to like to drug use. Like we're not going to talk about drugs. We're just going to say that they're awful. They'll kill you. They're dangerous. And then oftentimes what happens is people go out and use them because they've been told not to. Right. So abstinence only don't tend to be the most effective, but a lot of places still use them. So one or two last thoughts in our last like 2 minutes. So the second half of this is related to chapter 9, which is as we get older, right? And we're like more in like our late teens and 20s, we start dating or maybe entering into long-term relationships. But rather than talk about it, so we're going to watch a movie starting next class, and I'm going to be giving you a worksheet with some questions that go with it to fill out as we watch the film. So if you want to bring like snacks for yourself, we'll just put that out there for the next class, like you're welcome to. But we're gonna watch this starting on Wednesday and then into Monday. It'll take us 2 classes. So it's a slightly older movie. We're gonna watch He's Just Not That Into You. But it's a great film that talks about a lot about communication and falling in love, talks about technology, pitfalls, and I think there's a lot of really like great conversation pieces in there that we'll talk about after we finish the film. So that's where we'll start on Wednesday. And again, that will take us 2 classes. I'm going to post the link to the video on Canvas. So if for some reason you miss Wednesday or you miss Monday, you can finish or start the movie. And then we'll collect it and talk about it next week. So just to kind of give you that preview. So I'll stop here for today. If I didn't get your worksheet for some reason from the song, make sure I get that. We'll pick up here on Wednesday. So have a good rest of the day, and I'll see you then.